April 30th, 1945, Führerbunker, Berlin. Joseph Goebbels sat in the concrete tomb that had become Nazi Germany's final command post. In his lap rested a leather-bound diary. He opened it to write his final entry, an entry that would never be published, never be read by the masses he'd spent 12 years manipulating. The words he wrote acknowledged what he'd spent those 12 years denying. The propaganda had failed. Not in the way propagandists usually fail. Goebbels' machinery had been brilliant, sophisticated beyond anything the world had seen. His films moved millions. His radio broadcasts reached tens of millions. His posters covered every wall in occupied Europe. But that wasn't the failure he wrote about. The failure was simpler, more brutal, more ironic. The propaganda had backfired. Every tool he'd created to strengthen the Reich had become a weapon in Allied hands. Every message designed to inspire Germans had created expectations he couldn't meet. Every promise made when Germany was winning became evidence of lies when Germany started losing. And in the final months, the most sophisticated propaganda machine in history had become the Reich's greatest liability. This is the story of how the masters of manipulation got manipulated, how the architects of psychological warfare lost the psychological war, how propaganda designed to control 80 million Germans ended up controlling nothing at all, except the speed of Germany's collapse. In 1933, when Hitler appointed Goebbels as Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the world had never seen anything like what followed. Goebbels was 35 years old, with a doctorate in literature from Heidelberg University. He'd spent the 1920s perfecting propaganda techniques for the Nazi Party. He'd edited Der Angriff, The Attack, a newspaper that specialized in vicious satire and emotional manipulation. He'd organized massive rallies in Berlin that turned politics into theater. He'd watched how crowds responded to different messages, different rhythms, different appeals. By the time Hitler made him propaganda minister, Goebbels had conducted what amounted to a decade-long laboratory experiment on the German mind. He knew exactly which buttons to push. Goebbels understood modern mass media in ways no politician had before. He understood that people believe what they see more than what they read. He understood that repetition creates truth in the human mind. He understood that emotion overpowers reason. He understood that you don't need to convince people of complex ideas. You just need to attach their existing prejudices to symbols they can rally around. He understood that propaganda worked best when people didn't realize they were being manipulated. Within months of taking office, Goebbels had seized control of every form of media in Germany. Radio became a state monopoly. Newspapers required government licenses. Films needed ministry approval. Books were censored, burned, or banned. Theaters, music, art, all fell under his authority. He didn't just control what Germans could see and hear, he controlled what they couldn't see and hear. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda employed 30,000 people at its peak. They didn't just create propaganda. They erased alternative viewpoints from German consciousness. For the first 6 years, the propaganda worked exactly as designed. Germans believed the swastika represented inevitable victory. They believed Hitler was a strategic genius who couldn't be defeated. They believed Germany's enemies were weak, corrupt, and doomed. They believed every military victory Goebbels announced. And for those first 6 years, Goebbels could point to reality to prove his propaganda true. Germany conquered Poland in 27 days. Norway fell in 2 months. France, the nation that had fought Germany to exhaustion in World War I, surrendered in 6 weeks. The propaganda had created expectations. And for 6 years, reality exceeded those expectations. This was Goebbels's golden age. This was when propaganda worked. This was when millions of Germans genuinely believed the thousand-year Reich would last exactly that long. Then came the winter of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, was supposed to end in 3 months. Goebbels had announced on German radio that Moscow would fall by October. He'd shown newsreels of German tanks rolling unstoppably across Soviet territory. He'd declared the Bolshevik enemy was collapsing, would surrender any day, was already defeated. December arrived. Moscow hadn't fallen. January came. German troops were dying in temperatures that reached -40 degrees. February. The Wehrmacht was retreating for the first time in the war. Goebbels faced a problem he'd never confronted before. He'd created expectations his military couldn't meet. He had 2 choices. Admit the propaganda had been wrong. Admit the enemy was stronger than predicted. Admit the war would be longer and harder than promised. Or double down on the lies. Goebbels chose the lies. He announced that the winter retreat was a strategic regrouping. He claimed German casualties were minimal while Soviet losses were catastrophic. He declared that spring 1942 would bring renewed offensive and certain victory. German soldiers on the Eastern Front read these reports. They knew they were lies. They'd watched their friends freeze to death in temperatures that no amount of propaganda could warm. Private Hans Roth, a Wehrmacht soldier, wrote in his diary on January 15, 1942, "Goebbels announces on the radio that our strategic withdrawal is proceeding according to plan. What plan? The plan to freeze to death? The plan to abandon our equipment because it won't start in -35 degrees? The plan to leave half our division dead in the snow?" Letters like Roth's were intercepted by German military censors by the thousands. They documented a growing divide between official propaganda and battlefield reality. The soldiers had seen the Soviet artillery that never seemed to run out of ammunition. They'd experienced the T-34 tanks that German propaganda claimed didn't exist. They'd fought Soviet troops who were supposed to have collapsed in the first weeks of the invasion. They'd experienced the Red Army counterattacks that Goebbels claimed weren't happening, and they started asking dangerous questions. If the propaganda lied about the Eastern Front, what else was it lying about? If Soviet strength had been this underestimated, how could Germany possibly win? If Goebbels was willing to lie to soldiers who were dying, what was he telling civilians back home? For the first time, Wehrmacht troops stopped believing German propaganda. They started listening to Soviet broadcasts instead. Soviet propaganda wasn't sophisticated, but it had one advantage. It acknowledged that the war was difficult. It admitted Soviet soldiers died. It admitted battles were hard fought. After years of German propaganda that promised easy victory, simple honesty felt revolutionary. German troops started passing around underground newspapers printed by communist resistance cells. They started writing letters home that contradicted everything Goebbels was saying, and the German military police started intercepting those letters. By March 1942, Wehrmacht mail censors were flagging over 30% of soldier letters as defeatist or undermining morale. That percentage had been under 3% in 1940. By spring 1942, German intelligence was reporting something terrifying to Nazi leadership. Morale was collapsing, not because of Allied propaganda, because of German propaganda. Soldiers and civilians had believed the promises. When those promises weren't delivered, trust evaporated. Goebbels had created the expectation of easy victory. When victory became difficult, people didn't blame the enemy for being stronger than expected. They blamed Hitler for lying about how strong the enemy was. The propaganda had backfired, but Goebbels couldn't stop. Stopping would mean admitting everything before had been lies. So he escalated. In February 1943 came the moment that would define the rest of the war. The Battle of Stalingrad ended with the surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and 91,000 German soldiers. It was the single largest defeat in German military history. It was also the first major defeat Goebbels couldn't hide. Too many German families had sons and husbands in the Sixth Army. Too many cities had sent entire battalions that never came home. The scale of the loss was too large to conceal. Goebbels made a decision. On February 18, 1943, he delivered what would become his most famous speech, the Sportpalast speech. Total war speech. He gathered 14,000 carefully selected Nazi Party loyalists in Berlin's Sportpalast arena. He packed the building with the most fanatical supporters he could find, people who would cheer on cue, who would shout the responses he needed, who would create the impression of national enthusiasm. Cameras filmed every moment. Radio broadcast it live to 80 million Germans. Goebbels stood before them and did something he'd never done before. He admitted Germany was losing. He acknowledged the misfortune of the past weeks. He spoke of the serious dangers facing the Reich. He admitted the Soviet Union was stronger than Germany had claimed. Then he asked his famous 10 questions. Do you believe with the Führer and us in the final total victory of the German people? The crowd roared, yes. Do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can imagine today? The crowd screamed, yes. Are you ready to follow the Führer through thick and thin, to accept the heaviest personal burdens? Yes, yes, yes. Goebbels had orchestrated what looked like spontaneous enthusiasm. The cameras captured a nation united in fanatical determination. The propaganda department distributed photos of the cheering crowds to newspapers across Germany. The message was clear. The German people were ready to fight harder, sacrifice more, endure anything for victory. It was Goebbels' finest performance. It was also the moment his propaganda machine began its final fatal backfire. Because while the carefully selected audience in the Sportpalast roared their approval, millions of Germans listening at home heard something different. They heard Goebbels admitting the war was going badly. They heard him asking them to sacrifice even more after years of rationing, bombing, and death. They heard him promising victory, the same victory he'd been promising since 1939. They heard him asking if they wanted total war, as if the war they'd been fighting for 3 years hadn't already been total. German civilians didn't hear inspiring resolve, they heard desperation. Margaret Sommer, a Catholic relief worker in Berlin, wrote in her diary after the speech, Goebbels wants total war. We've had total war for 3 years. What he really means is he wants total sacrifice. He wants us to give more while receiving nothing. The speech terrified me, not because of what he said, but because it confirmed we are losing. Within weeks, German intelligence reports documented the speech's actual effect. The SD, the Nazi security service, conducted secret morale assessments across Germany. Their February 1943 report stated, the propaganda minister's speech has created significant anxiety among the population. Many citizens interpret his admission of serious dangers as confirmation that previous victory announcements were exaggerated or false. The report continued. Workers in several factories have been heard saying they no longer believe official casualty figures. One worker stated, if they're only now telling us the truth about how bad things are, they must have been lying all along. Morale hadn't improved, it had collapsed further. Germans interpreted Goebbels' admission of danger as confirmation that everything before had been lies. If they were only now being told the truth about how serious the situation was, what else had been lies? How many victories announced on radio had actually been defeats? How many casualty figures had been fabricated? How long had the Reich been lying to them? How much worse was the real situation than even this honest speech admitted? The Sportpalast speech had created a permission structure. Once Goebbels admitted things were bad, Germans felt licensed to acknowledge things were worse than bad. The speech designed to rally the nation had instead validated doubt. And then the Allied bombing began in earnest. The Royal Air Force had been bombing German cities since 1942, but the raids intensified dramatically after Stalingrad. In March 1943, the RAF launched the Battle of the Ruhr, 5 months of sustained bombing against industrial targets. In July and August 1943, Operation Gomorrah destroyed Hamburg, killing 42,000 civilians, in firestorms that created winds strong enough to uproot trees. Berlin, Cologne, Essen, Munich, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, every major German city came under systematic attack. By 1944, British and American bombers were conducting raids with 1,000 aircraft at once. Goebbels' propaganda faced a problem. He'd spent 3 years telling Germans that the Luftwaffe was invincible, that British and American bombers were being shot down in massive numbers, that Germany's air defenses were impenetrable. His newsreels showed German flak batteries in action, fighter pilots describing victories, crashed Allied bombers displayed as trophies. His radio broadcasts announced that RAF Bomber Command was suffering unsustainable losses. He claimed that for every German civilian killed, 10 Allied airmen died. Now German civilians watched British bombers fly over their cities every night, mostly unmolested. They watched entire neighborhoods burn to the ground, while radio announcers insisted only a few bombers had gotten through. They spent every night in bomb shelters, while Goebbels' broadcasts insisted German air superiority was intact. They pulled bodies from rubble, while propaganda claimed civilian casualties were minimal. The disconnect became impossible to ignore. A German woman in Cologne wrote to her husband at the front in March 1944, "Goebbels says the bombing is under control. I watched 800 bombers fly over us last night. Our street no longer exists. The propaganda lies to us every day, and we watch our city die every night." The propaganda wasn't just failing, it was making things worse. Every time Goebbels claimed German air defenses had shot down 100 enemy bombers, civilians who'd watched those bombers return safely home knew he was lying. Every casualty figure Goebbels announced, always minimized, always optimistic, was contradicted by the funerals happening in every German city. Every claim of military success was contradicted by the reality of Germany losing territory on every front. Every announcement of new wonder weapons that would turn the tide was followed by more defeats, more retreats, more cities reduced to rubble. The propaganda machine that had created fanatic loyalty from 1933 to 1941 was creating active disbelief from 1943 to 1945. German civilians developed what historians would later call propaganda fatigue. They stopped attending mandatory political rallies. They tuned out radio broadcasts. They stopped reading newspapers unless searching for practical information about air raid schedules or ration distributions. The SD, the security service, documented this collapse in brutal detail. A March 1944 report from Bavaria stated, "The population no longer believes official victory announcements." When asked about military prospects, workers respond with bitter laughter. One stated, "They told us we'd be in Moscow by Christmas 1941. They told us Stalingrad was a strategic victory. They told us the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. Why would anyone believe them now?" A May 1944 report from Hamburg noted, "Air raid victims openly mock propaganda, claims that bomber losses are unsustainable for the enemy. Last night's raid involved an estimated 900 aircraft. If the enemy is losing hundreds of bombers per raid as claimed, where do these new aircraft come from?" By mid-1944, German propaganda had lost the ability to shape opinion. It could only report events Germans could see with their own eyes. And even then, Germans assumed the truth was worse than reported. When Goebbels announced that Berlin had suffered some damage from bombing, Berliners translated this as catastrophic destruction. When he claimed Germany was conducting defensive operations on the Eastern Front, Germans understood this meant retreating in chaos. The propaganda had created its own reverse code. Whatever Goebbels said, Germans assumed the opposite was closer to truth. And Goebbels couldn't stop. Stopping meant admitting the Reich was doomed. Admitting defeat would accelerate collapse, so he kept broadcasting victories that weren't happening. Kept announcing imminent counter-offensives that never came. Kept promising wonder weapons that would turn the tide, the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter. Each promise that failed to materialize eroded credibility further. The V-1 and V-2 were launched against London in 1944. Goebbels announced they would force Britain to surrender. London wasn't destroyed. Britain didn't surrender. The weapons, while terrifying, didn't change the war's trajectory. Each announced victory, followed by visible retreat, made the next announcement less believable. Each claim of enemy weakness, contradicted by enemy advances, made Germans wonder if anything Goebbels said was true. The propaganda had entered a death spiral from which there was no recovery. But the most brutal backfire was yet to come. And it came from the most unexpected source: British propaganda operators who had studied Goebbels' methods and learned to use them against him. In 1941, Winston Churchill had created the Political Warfare Executive, Britain's psychological warfare unit. Its mission was to undermine German morale through propaganda. But the man who would orchestrate the most effective anti-German propaganda wasn't a soldier or a politician. He was a British-Australian journalist named Sefton Delmer. Delmer had grown up in Berlin. He spoke German fluently, with a perfect Berlin accent. He'd watched Nazi propaganda work firsthand, and he understood something crucial. The best way to undermine Nazi propaganda wasn't to contradict it. It was to amplify it. In 1942, Delmer launched a black propaganda radio station called Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais. The station pretended to be a German military radio station broadcasting from occupied France. It played German military music, the same marches Wehrmacht soldiers heard on official stations. It featured German-speaking announcers with authentic regional accents. It broadcast Wehrmacht news and updates in the exact format German military radio used. It opened with military signals and call signs that sounded completely official. It sounded exactly like an official German armed forces station. Delmer had recruited German POWs, anti-Nazi refugees, and German Jews who'd fled to Britain. These weren't actors reading scripts. They were native German speakers who understood military culture, regional dialects, and the subtle linguistic markers that created authenticity. One announcer was a former Wehrmacht sergeant who'd been captured in North Africa. Another was a German communist who'd fled Berlin in 1934. A third was the son of a German general who'd opposed Hitler and been executed. But it wasn't. It was a British operation, broadcast from England using the most powerful transmitter in the world, a 500-kilowatt monster called Aspidistra. The transmitter had been secretly transported from Radio Luxembourg. It was powerful enough to override German military radio frequencies. It could be heard clearly across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The broadcasts reached every German soldier on the Western Front, and many on the Eastern Front as well. And slowly, carefully, Delmer began inserting poison into the programming. The station didn't contradict Goebbels. Instead, it used Goebbels' own propaganda against him. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Delmer understood that direct contradiction would be dismissed as enemy lies, but information that appeared to come from German sources would be trusted. When Goebbels announced a great German victory, Soldatensender Calais would celebrate it, then add details Goebbels had left out. Details about which units had taken the heaviest casualties during the victory. Details about which Nazi party officials had sent their children to safety in Switzerland while German soldiers died at the front. Details about black market operations run by senior SS officers selling stolen supplies. Details about which generals were sleeping with whose wives while their husbands fought. Details about Wehrmacht officers living in luxury in Paris while frontline troops ate scraps. One particularly effective broadcast in August 1943 congratulated the Wehrmacht on its strategic withdrawal from Sicily. Then it mentioned casually that General so-and-so had been seen at a Berlin nightclub the night before the withdrawal began. Then it noted that his adjutant had purchased a villa in Bavaria using money from sources that weren't his military salary. Then it suggested that perhaps some officers were more concerned with their post-war finances than with holding Sicily. The broadcast mixed accurate military reporting with devastating personal details that undermined respect for military leadership. German soldiers listening couldn't dismiss it as Allied propaganda. It came from what sounded like a German military source, and the personal details were specific enough to seem credible. The station mixed 90% accurate military information with 10% devastating truths that Goebbels' propaganda had tried to hide. German soldiers couldn't tell which was propaganda and which was real. It all sounded official. It all came from what seemed to be a German military source. The music was right. The announcers sounded authentic. The format matched German military radio perfectly. By 1943, intelligence estimates suggested 41% of German soldiers listened to Soldatensender Calais regularly. It was one of the 3 most popular stations among German troops, and it was completely undermining Wehrmacht morale. The genius of Delmer's operation was that it used Goebbels' own credibility against him. Goebbels had spent a decade building trust in official German radio. Soldatensender Calais exploited that trust. When the station reported accurate military news, soldiers believed it. When it then reported that Nazi officials were corrupt, soldiers believed that too. When it claimed senior Wehrmacht officers were plotting against Hitler, soldiers started suspecting their own commanders. Goebbels tried to counter it. He announced that Soldatensender Calais was an enemy propaganda station. But that created a new problem. If Soldatensender Calais was enemy propaganda, why did it report accurate German military victories? Why did it know details about German operations that only German intelligence should know? The more Goebbels tried to discredit the station, the more Germans wondered why he was trying so hard to silence a station that sounded like official German radio. The British black propaganda operation had done what Allied white propaganda never could. It had gotten German soldiers and civilians to doubt their own government using sources that sounded German. But Delmer wasn't finished. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed at Normandy, Soldatensender Calais broadcast the news before any official German station. It reported, accurately, that the Atlantic Wall had been breached. It gave accurate details about which German divisions were being overrun. It provided accurate updates on Allied advances. German soldiers on the Western Front heard about D-Day from what they thought was a German military radio station before they heard it from their own commanders. The psychological impact was devastating. If a German station was reporting this before official channels, the invasion must be even worse than the report suggested. If their own command structure was slower than a military radio station, the Wehrmacht must be in complete chaos. The credibility Goebbels had spent 11 years building had been weaponized against him. Every successful propaganda technique he'd developed, emotional manipulation, repetition, creating trusted sources, bypassing rational thought, was being used by the Allies to destroy German morale. And there was nothing he could do about it. Ordering Germans not to listen to enemy radio required admitting enemy radio existed and was effective. Trying to discredit specific enemy broadcasts meant repeating those broadcasts, amplifying their message. Offering counter-propaganda required admitting the original propaganda had been questioned. Goebbels was trapped. His own methods had created the trap. But the most spectacular propaganda backfire of the entire war came from Germany's ally, Japan, and it came from a propaganda campaign based on mythology that was 600 years old. In 1274 and 1281, Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan had attempted to invade Japan. Both invasions failed when typhoons destroyed the Mongol fleets. Japanese historians called these storms kamikaze, divine wind. The storms were interpreted as proof that Japan was divinely protected, that the gods would defend the sacred islands from foreign invasion. For 6 centuries, the kamikaze legend remained a cultural memory. Then came World War II. By 1944, Japan was losing badly. The Battle of Midway had destroyed Japan's carrier fleet. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific. The Japanese combined fleet had been decimated. Japanese industrial capacity couldn't replace losses fast enough. Experienced pilots were dead, and undertrained replacements were being shot down in their first missions. Japanese military leadership faced the same problem Germany faced. Reality had diverged from propaganda promises. For 3 years, Japanese propaganda had announced glorious victories. The military had told civilians that American forces were weak, cowardly, and demoralized. Now American forces were winning every major engagement. On October 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro made a desperate decision. He organized the first official kamikaze unit, the Shinpu Tokotai, Divine Wind Special Attack Unit. The concept was simple. Pilots would load their aircraft with explosives and deliberately crash into American warships. The pilot would die, but the impact would hopefully sink the ship. It was suicide warfare on an institutional scale. It was also militarily questionable. Each kamikaze attack destroyed an aircraft Japan couldn't replace and killed a pilot Japan desperately needed. Even if the attack succeeded and sank an American ship, the exchange rate was terrible. Japan was trading scarce, valuable resources for one-time attacks with low success rates. But military logic wasn't the point. This was psychological warfare, aimed at both the enemy and Japan's own population. Onishi needed to make this tactic seem not just acceptable, but honorable. So he resurrected the kamikaze legend. Japanese propaganda announced that the divine winds were returning. Modern kamikaze pilots would become the spiritual successors to the storms that had saved Japan from the Mongols. They would be celebrated as gods, enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, immortalized as saviors of the nation. Their sacrifice was portrayed not as suicide, but as the highest form of patriotic duty. Their deaths wouldn't be waste, they would be transcendence. Japanese propaganda went into overdrive. Newspapers printed dramatic accounts of kamikaze heroism, complete with photographs of smiling pilots before their final missions. Radio broadcasts featured emotional send-offs of pilots heading to their deaths, with patriotic music and tearful tributes. Newsreels showed kamikaze pilots waving to cameras, writing final letters to their families, seemingly eager to die for the emperor. The propaganda emphasized that these young men were volunteers, that they begged for the honor of dying for Japan. Some coverage compared them to cherry blossoms, beautiful in their brief existence, noble in their falling. School textbooks were rewritten to emphasize the original kamikaze legend. The 1943 editions dedicated 3 times as much space to the Mongol invasions as previous versions. The new textbooks explicitly connected the 13th century storms to modern kamikaze pilots. Passages declared, "As Japan is a divine land, the wind blew fiercely against the surging hordes. The divine nature of our country delivered us from this great crisis. Now our brave pilots become the new divine wind." Young Japanese students were taught that the divine winds had saved Japan before and would save Japan again. The propaganda worked, at least initially. About 3,800 to 4,000 pilots carried out kamikaze attacks between October 1944 and August 1945. Some genuinely believed the propaganda. They'd been raised in a militaristic education system that taught emperor worship and glorified death in battle. For them, kamikaze was the ultimate honor. But many others were coerced. Letters and diaries recovered after the war revealed a different story. Flight Lieutenant Haruo Araki wrote to his wife 1 month after their wedding, "The happy dream is over. Tomorrow I will dive my plane into an enemy ship. When I look back, I see that I was very cold-hearted to you. Please forgive me." His letter revealed no enthusiasm, no spiritual transcendence, just regret and resignation. Another pilot, whose name was redacted from official records, wrote, "I am going because I have no choice, not because I want to die, but because refusing would dishonor my family forever. I will smile for the cameras, I will wave to my commanders, but inside I am screaming." Japanese military culture made refusal almost impossible. Saying no meant dishonoring your family, your ancestors, your nation. Saying no meant being labeled a coward in a society where cowardice was worse than death. Saying no meant your family would be ostracized, your siblings' marriage prospects destroyed, your parents shamed. Some pilots who initially refused were beaten by their commanding officers. Others were told their families would lose their rations if they didn't volunteer. Many kamikaze pilots went to their deaths not because they believed the propaganda, but because the propaganda had made not dying a fate worse than death. Training was minimal, often just enough to take off and aim the aircraft. Many pilots had less than 50 hours of flight experience. Some had never fired the aircraft's guns or dropped a bomb in training. They didn't need to land safely, so landing procedures weren't taught. They just needed to fly in a straight line toward an American ship and not miss. And then the propaganda backfired in the most brutal way possible. Because the kamikaze attacks, while terrifying and occasionally effective, didn't change the war's outcome. Between October 1944 and August 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. They killed about 4,900 American sailors. Those are significant numbers, but they came at the cost of 3,800 to 4,000 Japanese pilots, plus several thousand more aircraft. Japan was losing pilots faster than America was losing ships. The exchange rate was catastrophic. And American anti-aircraft defenses improved rapidly. By early 1945, most kamikaze attacks were being shot down before reaching their targets. Japanese civilians were told that kamikaze pilots were turning the tide of war. Japanese civilians watched American forces advance steadily toward the home islands. The disconnect became impossible to ignore. If kamikaze were so effective, why was Japan losing? If divine winds were protecting Japan, why were American B-29 bombers burning Japanese cities to ashes every night? If the emperor's forces were unstoppable, why was defeat becoming obvious? The propaganda designed to inspire fanatical resistance had instead revealed how desperate Japan's situation had become. Only a nation on the verge of total defeat would resort to institutionalized suicide attacks. Only a military completely out of options would send thousands of barely trained pilots to certain death. The kamikaze program announced to the world that Japan was beaten, even as propaganda claimed it was winning. And the most bitter irony: the historical kamikaze, the divine winds that supposedly saved Japan from the Mongols, probably never happened the way Japanese propaganda claimed. Modern historians examining 13th century records found that the first Mongol invasion in 1274 was repelled primarily by Japanese defenders, not by storms. The second invasion in 1281 did encounter typhoons, but the scale of destruction was nowhere near what the legend claimed. The divine wind myth had been exaggerated over centuries, inflated for nationalistic purposes, and then weaponized as propaganda in World War II. Japan had sent 4,000 young men to die for a legend that wasn't even historically accurate. The propaganda had backfired into tragedy. But perhaps the most spectacularly failed propaganda campaign of the entire war belonged to a single man, William Joyce, better known as Lord Haw Haw. Joyce was an American-born British fascist who fled to Germany in August 1939. Within weeks, Joseph Goebbels had recruited him to broadcast English-language propaganda to Britain. Joyce's program was called Germany Calling. It aired multiple times daily on German radio, targeting British audiences. Joyce had a distinctive voice, nasal, sneering, with an exaggerated upper-class English accent. A British journalist, mocking this affected aristocratic tone, nicknamed him Lord Haw Haw. The name stuck. Joyce's propaganda followed Goebbels' playbook: undermine British confidence in their government, emphasize class divisions between wealthy elites and working-class soldiers, claim British democracy was a fraud controlled by Jewish businessmen and plutocrats, paint Hitler as Britain's savior from plutocratic oppression and communist threat, predict British defeat was inevitable, surrender was the only rational choice. His broadcasts featured segments like Schmidt and Smith, dialogues between a German and an Englishman, where Joyce played the Englishman criticizing his own country. He attacked Churchill personally, calling him the degenerate of Downing Street and that warmonger Churchill. He called British ministers names like Mr. Bleeding Bevan and Hoary Ernie. He described the British class system as an elaborate fraud designed to keep workers oppressed. In late 1939 and early 1940, Joyce's broadcasts were remarkably popular in Britain. Estimates suggested 6 to 9 million Britons listened regularly, nearly 1 in 5 people. A BBC survey in December 1939 found that 2/3 of British adults listened at least occasionally. Goebbels was thrilled, writing in his diary, "I tell the Führer about Lord Haw Haw's success, which is really astonishing." But the success wasn't what Goebbels thought it was. Part of the appeal was that Joyce was unintentionally hilarious. His sneering tone and pompous delivery made him a figure of mockery. His exaggerated upper-class accent sounded like a caricature of aristocracy. British comedians did Lord Haw Haw impressions in music halls, exaggerating his nasal tone for laughs. The BBC referenced him in comedy programs, turning him into a recurring joke. People would gather around radios to laugh at his broadcasts, turning his propaganda into entertainment. British pubs organised Lord Haw Haw listening parties, where patrons would drink and mock his predictions. Joyce predicted Britain would surrender within months. Britain didn't surrender. He predicted the Royal Navy would be destroyed. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. He predicted British morale would collapse under bombing. British morale, if anything, strengthened during the Blitz. Every prediction that failed to materialize made Joyce more of a joke. British listeners started tuning in specifically to mock his latest absurd claims. His propaganda had become comedy material, But then Joyce made a mistake that would seal his program's irrelevance. He started claiming he had detailed intelligence about specific British locations. He would mention that a certain town's clock tower was 2 minutes slow, or that a specific factory had been painted a particular colour, or that a village's pub had recently gotten new management. These claims were meant to frighten listeners, to suggest German intelligence was so sophisticated that they knew intimate details about every British town. The message was, "We are watching you, we know everything." Instead, it became a national game. British listeners would note what Joyce claimed and immediately verify whether it was true. Almost always, it wasn't. The clock wasn't slow, the factory hadn't been repainted, the pub management hadn't changed. Lord Haw Haw's supposed intelligence was revealed to be guesswork and lies. His credibility evaporated completely. By 1941, British intelligence assessments concluded that Joyce's broadcasts had zero effect on British morale. His propaganda had backfired so thoroughly that the British government stopped worrying about his influence. In April 1945, in his final broadcast, Joyce was reportedly drunk. His words slurred. His famous opening line, "Germany calling, Germany calling," came out garbled. He ranted about British defeat being inevitable even as British forces were occupying German territory. He signed off with "Heil Hitler" and "Farewell." 3 weeks later, British soldiers captured him near the Danish border. He was shot in the leg while trying to reach for forged papers. In September 1945, Joyce was tried for treason in London. The trial was a media sensation. He was convicted and hanged on January 3, 1946, the last person executed for treason in Britain. The man who spent 6 years broadcasting propaganda to break British morale had become a national joke. His execution was greeted not with anger or satisfaction, but with indifference. He'd become so irrelevant that most Britons didn't care whether he lived or died. His propaganda had failed so completely that his death barely registered. By April 1945, Joseph Goebbels could see the pattern. His diary entries from the final months of the war show a man watching his life's work disintegrate. He'd built the most sophisticated propaganda machine in history. He'd shaped the beliefs of 80 million Germans. He'd convinced a nation to follow Hitler into total war. And now that machinery was tearing the Reich apart. Every promise unfulfilled had eroded credibility. Every defeat minimized had created suspicion about what else was being hidden. Every claim of imminent victory, followed by visible retreat, had deepened despair. On April 21, 1945, Goebbels wrote, "Enemy propaganda is beginning to have an uncomfortably noticeable effect on the German people. Anglo-American leaflets are now no longer carelessly thrown aside, but are read attentively. British broadcasts have a grateful audience." The man who'd spent 12 years controlling German information was admitting that Germans now trusted enemy propaganda more than their own government. The ultimate backfire. On May 1, 1945, one day after Hitler's suicide, Goebbels poisoned his 6 children and had an SS officer shoot him and his wife. His final act was to ensure no propaganda could be extracted from his capture. Even in death, he was thinking about information control, but the Reich's propaganda failures hadn't ended with military defeat. They'd created something worse. They'd created a population that would never trust their government again. They'd created a society where official statements were automatically suspect. They'd created a generation that had learned the hard way that propaganda and reality could diverge catastrophically. German soldiers returning from Soviet prison camps in the 1950s reported that Soviet propaganda during their captivity had been remarkably effective, not because it was sophisticated, but because Germans had learned that their own government had lied to them about everything. The Nazi propaganda machine had been so dishonest for so long that Germans became vulnerable to any narrative that contradicted what the Nazis had told them. When Soviet propagandists claimed West Germany was controlled by American imperialists, German POWs were inclined to believe it. After all, German propaganda had told them America was weak, and America had crushed them. When communist propaganda claimed capitalism exploited workers, Germans who'd been exploited by Nazi war industries found it credible. When East German propaganda claimed the war had been entirely Hitler's fault, and ordinary Germans bore no responsibility, many eagerly accepted that narrative. It allowed them to separate themselves from the regime that had lied to them. Nazi propaganda had been so dishonest for so long that Germans in the post-war period became vulnerable to any propaganda that contradicted what the Nazis had told them. The backfire lasted decades. The psychological damage took generations to heal. The lessons were clear to anyone paying attention. Propaganda that creates expectations reality can't meet becomes a weapon against the propagandist. Every promise becomes a potential accusation. Every prediction becomes a test that reality will grade. Every claim of strength becomes a benchmark that failure will expose. Propaganda that requires perfect victories makes any defeat catastrophic for morale. If you tell your population they're invincible, the first loss destroys more than territory. It destroys belief. If you promise easy triumph, hard struggle looks like failure even when it's normal warfare. Propaganda that demands total belief makes any doubt fatal to credibility. Once people start questioning one claim, they question everything. Once trust breaks, it cannot be repaired by more propaganda. More propaganda after trust breaks just accelerates the collapse. Propaganda that can't adjust to changing circumstances becomes evidence of disconnection from reality. Goebbels couldn't pivot when Germany started losing without admitting he'd been lying when Germany was winning. He was trapped by his own success. The very effectiveness of his early propaganda made his later propaganda toxic. Goebbels had understood propaganda better than anyone before him, but he'd missed one crucial truth. Propaganda is a debt that reality eventually collects. Every promise made during wartime must eventually be matched by results. Every victory announced must actually happen. Every claim of strength must be backed by real strength. When the debt came due, the Reich couldn't pay. The propaganda machine designed to control German hearts and minds had instead created expectations Germany couldn't meet, promises Germany couldn't keep, and a credibility Germany couldn't recover. In February 1943, Albert Speer watched Goebbels deliver the total war speech. He later wrote, "I had never seen an audience so effectively roused to fanaticism." But he also noted that fanaticism lasted exactly 3 months. Then it turned to desperation. Then desperation turned to apathy. Then apathy turned to surrender. The propaganda that had built the Third Reich's power had accelerated its collapse. The tools Goebbels used to create loyalty had created distrust. The methods designed to inspire strength had revealed weakness. The machinery built to control millions had controlled nothing at all. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Within weeks, Allied psychological warfare units conducted assessments of German morale. Teams of researchers interviewed hundreds of German civilians and soldiers across the occupied zones. They wanted to understand what had broken German will to resist. They wanted to know whether Allied propaganda had been effective. What they discovered surprised them. The most common response wasn't anger at the Allies for bombing their cities. It wasn't hatred of the occupation forces. It wasn't despair at military defeat. It was anger at German propaganda. German civilians felt they'd been lied to for 12 years, betrayed by a government that had asked for total sacrifice while delivering total defeat. manipulated by propaganda that had promised victory and delivered catastrophe. German soldiers felt they'd been sent to die based on false information about enemy strength. They'd been told the Soviets would collapse in weeks. They'd fought for 4 years against an enemy that grew stronger every month. They'd been told Allied industrial capacity was inadequate. They'd watched American equipment flood the battlefield in quantities German propaganda claimed were impossible. German families felt betrayed by a government that had promised victory and delivered death. Mothers who'd lost sons were told those deaths were necessary sacrifices for inevitable triumph. When triumph became defeat, those sacrifices felt like waste. The propaganda had asked them to endure for victory. Victory never came. The endurance was for nothing. One German woman, interviewed by American researchers in Frankfurt, summarized the sentiment. Goebbels told us to sacrifice everything. We did. He promised us victory. He lied. Now we have nothing. Not our sons, not our homes, not our dignity, and not even the truth about why we lost them. The propaganda hadn't just failed. It had poisoned the relationship between the German people and their government so thoroughly that post-war Germany became obsessively committed to transparency, free press, and institutional skepticism of official narratives. The Federal Republic of Germany's constitution, written in 1949, explicitly protected press freedom. Article 5 guaranteed freedom of expression and prohibited censorship. It was a direct response to Goebbels' propaganda ministry. German media, after 1949, became among the most skeptical of government claims in the world. German journalists developed a culture of aggressive fact-checking. Every claim required multiple sources. Every statistic demanded documentation. Every government announcement met investigative scrutiny. German citizens developed institutional skepticism, default distrust of official information. Opinion surveys in the 1950s showed Germans were less likely to trust government statements than citizens of other Western democracies. This wasn't cynicism, it was learned caution from catastrophic deception. Modern Germany's media landscape, among the freest and most skeptical in the world, is a direct reaction to the propaganda catastrophe of 1933-1945. The Backfire shaped an entire nation for generations. The lies told between 1933 and 1945 created a society determined never to be lied to again. And what of the other propagandists? Lord Haw executed as a traitor, his broadcasts remembered only as comedy. The kamikaze program memorialized in Japan with ambivalence, honored as sacrifice, questioned as waste, studied as warning. Sefton Delmer celebrated as the man who beat the propaganda minister at his own game. But the real lesson wasn't about specific techniques, it was about hubris. Goebbels believed he could control reality through media control. He believed that if he could control the message, he could control the outcome. He believed propaganda could overcome military defeat, economic collapse, and strategic disaster. He was wrong. Propaganda can amplify reality, can interpret reality, can frame reality, but propaganda cannot replace reality. And when propaganda diverges too far from reality, it doesn't change reality. It destroys the propagandist's credibility. In his final diary entry before his suicide, Goebbels wrote one sentence that acknowledged this truth. He wrote, "We raised expectations we could not meet. Once expectations are raised and unmet, they transform from motivation to accusation. The people did not believe our enemies. They believed our promises. When our promises failed, so did their faith. 7 words summarized 12 years of work. So did their faith. The propaganda designed to create unshakable faith had created its opposite. The machinery built to control had lost all control. The tools meant to strengthen had weakened. The messages that inspired had embittered. They never expected their own propaganda to backfire so brutally. But it did, and the backfire was total, final, and complete. The most sophisticated propaganda operation in human history had become the Reich's most effective enemy. Joseph Goebbels had spent his career weaponizing media. In the end, his own weapons destroyed him. V for victory. The symbol came from the Allies, but the victory came partly from Goebbels' own propaganda collapsing under the weight of promises it couldn't keep. On January 3, 1946, William Joyce was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. His final words were, "In death as in life, I defy the Jews." Even at the end, he clung to the propaganda that had made him a joke, gotten him captured, gotten him convicted, and now had gotten him killed. He never understood that the propaganda had backfired, that the beliefs that felt so true to him had been absurd to everyone else, that the message he thought would liberate Britain had instead made him Britain's most famous traitor. He died still believing the propaganda. That might have been the cruelest backfire of all, 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 backfire of all.